In the early morning hours of May 26, 2013, somewhere off the coast of Nigeria, a team of saturation divers descended into the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Their mission was a grim one. They were there to recover the bodies of crew members from a tugboat that had capsized and sunk to the ocean floor just days earlier. At a depth of around 100 feet or 30 meters, one of the divers entered the pitch-black interior of the sunken vessel, his camera light cutting through the murky water. As he made his way through the ship, he suddenly noticed something that stopped him cold. There, in the beam of his light, he saw a human hand reaching out toward him from the darkness. But this hand was not attached to a corpse. It was moving. What happened next would be one of the most remarkable survival stories in maritime history, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. To understand how impossible Harrison Okene's survival was, we first need to understand what he was working on and what went wrong that night. Tugboats are specialized vessels designed to maneuver much larger ships in and out of harbors, through narrow channels, or to offshore oil platforms. They are essentially the workhorses of the maritime industry, and in Nigeria's oil-rich waters, they are critical infrastructure. The Jascon 4 was one of these tugboats, measuring about 108 feet or 33 meters in length. On May 26, 2013, it was stationed near an oil tanker about 20 miles or 32 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria in the Atlantic Ocean. The crew's job was relatively routine: to stabilize a Chevron oil tanker and provide support while it was being loaded. The Jascon 4 had a crew of 12 men that night, including the captain, engineers, and deckhands. Among them was a 29-year-old cook named Harrison Okene. Harrison had been working on tugboats for several years, and this was just another shift in what had become a familiar routine. Now, on the evening of May 25th, the crew carried out their duties as normal. The sea conditions were relatively calm, and there was nothing to suggest that anything was out of the ordinary. Harrison finished preparing the evening meal for the crew, cleaned up the galley, and then retired to his cabin for the night. In the early morning hours of May 26, around 4:30 a.m., Harrison woke up needing to use the bathroom. This is an important detail because his cabin and the bathroom were located in the crew's quarters, which happened to be in a specific section of the ship. He got up, left his cabin, and walked down the narrow hallway to the bathroom. It was at approximately 4:50 a.m. when Harrison was in the bathroom that he felt the ship suddenly lurch to one side. Living and working on boats, you get used to the normal movements of a vessel on the water. But this was different. The angle was wrong. The ship was tilting and it was not stopping. Within seconds, the Jascon 4 began to capsize. When a ship capsizes, especially a tugboat that sits relatively low in the water, it happens fast. In this case, the ship rolled over in less than a minute. Harrison, still in the bathroom, was thrown against the walls as the entire vessel turned upside down and began its descent to the ocean floor. The cause of the capsizing is still somewhat contested, but the leading theory is that a sudden swell or wave hit the tugboat at an angle while it was performing its stabilization duties. Another possibility is that a cable snapped and the sudden release of tension caused the ship to list. Either way, the result was catastrophic. As the ship rolled and sank, Harrison was thrown around violently in the small bathroom. Water began rushing into the ship from multiple points, flooding compartments at an alarming rate. In the chaos and darkness, Harrison managed to grab onto a pipe or fixture to prevent himself from being swept away by the rushing water. Then, as quickly as it started, the movement stopped. The ship had come to rest on the ocean floor, completely inverted, sitting upside down at a depth of 100 feet or 30 meters below the surface. Harrison found himself in total darkness. The ship's power was gone, so there were no lights anywhere. He was disoriented, terrified, and had no idea if anyone else had survived. He was wearing only his underwear, as he had been using the bathroom when the ship went down. Now, what happened next is where the physics of Harrison's survival becomes both fascinating and terrifying. When the Gascon 4 capsized and sank, it did not flood completely. Instead, air became trapped in certain pockets of the ship as it descended. This is because when a vessel sinks in an inverted position, the air inside rises to what is now the lowest point of the ship, which would have been as the floor when it was right side up. The bathroom where Harrison was located ended up being in one of these air pockets. As the water rushed in and the ship settled, the air was compressed by the water pressure at a depth of 100 feet, creating a small bubble of breathable atmosphere. This pocket was roughly 4 feet high, or about 1.2 meters, essentially the height of the overturned bathroom. But here is where it gets even more precarious. At 100 feet underwater, the pressure is approximately 4 atmospheres, which is 4 times the pressure at sea level. That compression meant the air in Harrison's pocket was denser than normal air, and it also meant the oxygen was being consumed more quickly than it would be at the surface. Harrison was trapped in a tiny space, in complete darkness, with freezing water up to his waist and no way to communicate with the outside world. He had no food, no fresh water, and no idea if anyone knew the ship had sunk. The water temperature at that depth was cold enough to cause hypothermia, and he was essentially naked. Harrison quickly realized he was not alone in the wreckage. As his eyes adjusted to the absolute darkness, he could hear sounds through the water and through the metal hull. Fish were feeding on the bodies of his crewmates who had not survived the initial sinking. He could hear them bumping against the walls, and at one point, he felt something brush against his leg in the water. Harrison later described the psychological horror of those first hours. He did not know how long the air would last. He did not know if rescue would come. He did not know if the ship would shift and flood his tiny pocket. All he could do was pray, stay calm, and try to conserve his energy. As the hours turned into a full day, Harrison faced a desperate decision about the water he was standing in. He was desperately thirsty, but the water around him was contaminated with diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and other chemicals from the ship. Drinking it could make him sick, but dehydration would kill him just as surely as drowning. He also had to fight off hypothermia. The cold water was sapping his body heat, and despite the air pocket, he was constantly wet. He tried to minimize his time in the water, perching on whatever surfaces he could find in the cramped space, but there was nowhere completely dry. As the second day began, Harrison's situation was becoming dire. He was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and exhausted from the constant mental strain. The carbon dioxide levels in his air pocket were rising, which would cause headaches, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. The oxygen content was dropping, and he could feel himself getting weaker. Meanwhile, on the surface, rescue operations had begun. The Gascon 4 had been reported missing, and when debris was spotted, it became clear the ship had sunk. The company that owned the tugboat, West African Ventures, contracted a South African diving company called DCN Diving to attempt a recovery operation. Now, it is important to note that this was intended to be a body recovery mission, not a rescue. No one believed there could be survivors. A ship that had been underwater for more than 48 hours with 12 crew members, the assumption was that they would be recovering remains to give the families closure. The diving team arrived on site and began preparations. They were using a technique called saturation diving, which is the same method we have discussed in previous videos. Essentially, divers live in a pressurized chamber and descend in a diving bell to work at depth for extended periods without having to decompress after each dive. Saturation kept the team ready to work at depth. On the morning of May 28th, approximately 60 hours after the Jascon 4 had sunk, the dive team descended to the wreck. Their plan was to systematically search the vessel and recover any bodies they found. One of the divers, whose camera was recording the operation, entered the hull through a hatch. He made his way through the dark, flooded corridors, his light cutting through the murky water and illuminating the eerie scene. Furniture, equipment, and debris floated in the inverted space. Then, as he approached what would have been the crew quarters area, he saw something that did not make sense. A hand, a human hand reaching toward him from out of the darkness. His first thought was that it was a body caught on something, and he moved closer to investigate. But then the hand moved deliberately, reaching out toward his light. The diver recoiled in shock, and in that moment, he saw a face emerge from a pocket of air. It was Harrison Okene, alive after 60 hours on the ocean floor. The video footage of this moment is absolutely incredible. You can hear the diver's surprise through his breathing apparatus, and Harrison's desperate face appears in the camera light. The diver immediately grabbed Harrison's hand, and you can see Harrison gripping it tightly as if afraid to let go. The problem now was how to get Harrison to the surface safely. At 100 feet depth, for 60 hours, Harrison's body was fully saturated with nitrogen. If he was brought up too quickly, he would suffer severe or fatal decompression sickness, also known as the bends. The nitrogen dissolved in his blood and tissues would form bubbles, causing excruciating pain, paralysis, or death. The divers quickly communicated the situation to the surface team. This went from a body recovery to an emergency rescue in seconds, and every decision now mattered. They couldn't just swim him to the surface. That would kill him just as surely as leaving him there. The solution was to bring down a diving bell, get Harrison inside, and then slowly bring him up while managing the decompression carefully. But first, they needed to get him breathing the right gas mixture. At that depth, and after that much time, Harrison needed to be transitioned carefully from the compressed air he'd been breathing to a helium-oxygen mixture that the divers used. A diving helmet was brought down and placed over Harrison's head. For the first time in 60 hours, he was getting fresh gas to breathe. Then, carefully, the divers helped him out of his air pocket and into the water. Harrison later described this moment as terrifying. He had spent 60 hours keeping himself out of that water, and now he had to trust these strangers to take him into it. They guided him through the flooded corridors of the ship, and Harrison had to swim past the bodies of his crewmates. Eventually, they reached the diving bell that had been lowered to the wreck. Harrison was pulled inside, and the hatch was sealed. But his ordeal wasn't over, not even close. Because of how long he'd been at depth, Harrison now faced another 60 hours of decompression. He was transferred to a decompression chamber on the rescue vessel, where the pressure was slowly reduced over the next 2.5 days to allow the nitrogen to safely leave his body. During this time, Harrison was monitored constantly by medical personnel. He was rewarmed, rehydrated, and fed carefully. The psychological impact of what he'd been through was also becoming apparent. He'd watched his ship sink, survived alone in the dark for days, heard fishes feeding on his friends, and then had to swim past their bodies to escape. Finally, after the full decompression process was complete, Harrison Okene emerged from the chamber. He had survived 60 hours at the bottom of the ocean and another 60 hours of decompression. Against all odds, he walked away from an incident that had killed all 11 of his crewmates. The story made international headlines. A video of the diver finding Harrison alive went viral, and people around the world were amazed by his survival. Experts calculated that Harrison had been breathing air at such high pressure that his tiny pocket should have run out of oxygen much sooner. His survival was attributed to a combination of factors: the size of the air pocket, the cold temperature slowing his metabolism, his ability to stay calm and conserve energy, and sheer luck. Harrison later explained that his faith kept him alive. He prayed continuously during those 60 hours, and he believed that God had a plan for him. When he saw the diver's light, he said it was like seeing an angel appear in the darkness. In the aftermath, investigations were launched into what caused the Gascon 4 to capsize. The ship was eventually raised and examined, but the exact cause remained somewhat unclear. Structural failure, human error, and environmental factors were all considered, but no single definitive cause was identified. As for Harrison Okene, the trauma of the experience had a lasting impact. He suffered from nightmares and post-traumatic stress disorder. For months, he could not sleep without lights on, and he refused to go near the water. He eventually returned to work in the maritime industry, but never as a cook on a tugboat again. Instead, he underwent training to become a certified diver. In a remarkable turn, Harrison decided that the best way to overcome his fear was to face it directly. He trained with the very same company that had rescued him, DCN Diving, and became a saturation diver himself. He wanted to help rescue others who might find themselves in similar situations. The diver who found Harrison, whose name was Nico van Heerden, said that discovering Harrison alive was the most shocking and incredible moment of his 28-year diving career. The two men stayed in contact afterward, and Nico attended Harrison's wedding years later. Today, Harrison Okene's story is used in maritime safety training around the world. It is a reminder of how unpredictable and dangerous working at sea can be, but also of the incredible human will to survive. The fact that he spent 60 hours in a space no bigger than a small bathroom in freezing darkness, listening to fish feed on his friends, and emerged not only alive, but determined to move forward with his life, is nothing short of miraculous. The wreckage of the Gascon 4 serves as a grave for the 11 men who did not make it that night. Their families received closure, and several of the bodies were recovered and given proper burials. But Harrison's survival, as impossible as it seemed, proved that even in the darkest circumstances, hope can persist.